So let's grab some bionics, chant some hymns to the Omnissiah, and sell a kidney, because today we're talking about starting an Admech army in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Admech, and given the recent release of the new codex, I thought it would be interesting to talk through a few of the pros and cons and ways that you could think about starting an army of heavily cyborgized humans from Mars. In the video I thought we'd talk through why collect Adeptus Mechanicus in the first place, a few ideas for gathering some initial info and planning an army out before you start, some ideas for first miniature purchases, and expanding an army from there. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. So first up, why might you wish to collect an Adeptus Mechanicus army in the first place? The Admech, as the army is frequently shortened to, basically represent the cyborgized armies of the Forge Worlds of Warhammer 40k. Ranks of their Skitarii, rank and file humans with machine parts augmenting their limbs, battle servitors, and all manner of arcane technology that the Mechanicus has access to, and due to the somewhat backward nature of Warhammer 40k, much of their technological marvels are treated with as much superstition and religious fervour as they are with technical know-how and expertise. The Mechanicus maybe don't tend to be at the forefront of most of mankind's conquests and wars, but are frequently seeing heavy action in Forge Worlds strewn across the galaxy under siege from various Chaos or Xenos threats, or setting forth in great explorator fleets to recover arcane technology from STCs long since forgotten, carrying scraps of information back to the Forge to be hoarded jealously. When they make war, they don't tend to be in quite as great numbers as the Hammer of the Emperor, the Imperial Guard, but tend to be armed with really quite powerful arms and war gear. Arcane things like phosphor weapons, neutron lasers, and radium guns, not uncommon to see within their arsenal. Cohorts of Skitarii march in lockstep, battle doctrine is flowing to them via their data tethers conducted by their tech priests. Overall, I think they're really quite an interesting faction, and their miniatures since they came out have been generally really quite well received. As factions go, they're a somewhat more recent addition than some to Warhammer 40k, having had their entire range developed within the past 10 years. They're pretty detailed, and perhaps particularly out of some of their more recent ones, they do have some slight steampunk vibes as well. Lots of exotic technology that's kind of mad, and sits somewhere between a terrible idea and a genius one. Their miniatures perhaps do have a bit of a reputation for being incredibly detailed and making them a bit of a hassle to assemble, paint and store compared with most armies in the game. Even their basic troopers like these Skitarii Rangers here have a lot of different textures on them in really quite close proximity to each other. Things like cloth colour, various types of leather, metallics and brass all next to each other. But I feel that in general their miniature range is really quite well light and does represent them rather nicely on the tabletop. Their range is maybe a little bit split into the two major halves of the army. The Skitarii as their programmed, augmented human soldiers, and then Cult Mechanicus stuff that has more the tech priests, battle servitors, and electro priests, representing them as the religious cult sort of organisation. Here are a few examples of Admech miniatures. Here on the top left we've got a tech priest engineer, maybe one of the lowlier, more rank and file versions of tech priests. There's a Cataphrone battle servitor on the bottom left, grafted onto a great track unit with an arc rifle. The Onager Dunecrawler is the Adeptus Mechanicus' walking crab tank that can pack a number of fairly exciting wargear options like the Icarus Ray with its anti-air capabilities here, or the massive neutron laser. There's a Taraxi Sterilizer with a phosphor torch on the top right, a great backwing flamethrower infantry descending on high to purge the enemy foe, and a Skitarii Ranger Alpha with their classic flowing red robes. This one on the bottom right is armed with an Arkmaw and an Archaeotech pistol. There's plenty more beyond that though. There's Belisarius Call on the bottom left. He's basically Commander-in-Chief of the Admech and kind of an important character within 40k lore. He was the one who masterminded the entire Primaris project, a clunky Castellan robot that is sort of semi-AI tech heresy, but apparently just on the right side of the Omnissiah's graces as you program in their orders. And on the bottom right is the Adeptus Mechanicus transport, the Scorpius Dune Rider, basically a hovercraft transport, looking very similar to a Normandy Lander type of craft. Price-wise is probably where it's the worst news for the Admech. Unfortunately, collecting this army is about as expensive as Warhammer 40k gets. Lots of the miniatures just cost an awful lot for the amount of plastic that you get. Coming in small elite squads doesn't really help too much, but in game, at least at the moment, they don't tend to cost very many points in game at all. So to get a functional army of any given points value on the table, you'll generally need to spend really quite a lot. I don't think that the latest Combat Patrol set really helped out with that very much either. The miniatures in it are quite fun, but it doesn't really get you very many points on the board. I feel like the overall pricing at the moment is enough of the factor that it does genuinely discourage some people from collecting. Finally, for gameplay, Adeptus Mechanicus has had their recent codex out, so now have a full complement of different detachments that you can play with in Warhammer 40k, and their playstyle has perhaps varied a bit over the years. In 9th edition, they tended to be really quite big on stacking boosts and fairly complex command benefits, but with the simplification of rules in 10th edition, that's less the case. Their main faction rule being the doctrine or imperatives, whether you decide to basically go for assault weapons or heavy weapons each turn for the majority of your Skitarii. A rule that's almost entirely range focused as well. It definitely does feel like the army has a more range than melee focus overall, but there's definitely some combat capable units. With the various flavours of Skitarii elites and fast attack, I feel like they perhaps have a slight overabundance of cheap nuisance skirmish type units. Everything from the chicken walkers to the Taraxi, the Cerberus cavalry and the Sicarians. And in their strongest builds at the moment, it feels like they're often not really focusing as much on damage on the board as they are in a whole load of board control and skirmishing type units perhaps. Their different detachments could definitely push you in one way or another for building an army though. Currently for in-game power, it's kind of early days with the codex just coming out. They're probably a little bit lower in the rankings in Warhammer 40k power overall. Though I feel like currently their codex doesn't have good internal balance. Just a few strong units seem to be really quite ahead of the rest of the book in carrying the codex to some wins, maybe in particular the Cataphren Breachers or various flavours of Iron Striders and Dragoons, plus some Skitarii Vanguard and Dune Riders, all backed up by a few of those interference and harassment type units. Overall, at the moment, I would say that Admech is perhaps a little bit more of a challenging army to play than most. Really quite costly, miniatures that are a bit more detailed and harder to assemble than some, and perhaps a little bit more nuanced gameplay than some of the other armies out there. Though none of that's necessarily a bad thing if you're up for a challenge though. They've got some awesome lore and really quite cool miniatures on the table. In any case, if you should decide to collect an army of the force of the Omnissiah, there's plenty of places that you can go for a bit more information and maybe get a bit more of an idea as to what you're getting into. I think it'd be fairly reasonable to pick up the Codex as an early purchase if you are thinking that you're collecting the Force. It's got some handy enough sections on the lore of the army, some miniature galleries for Admech models, and also all the current rules to use them in game, with the unit datasheets and detachment rules. You could also think about messing around with some army lists. Battlescribe, New Recruit, Warhapedia, or Games Workshop's app are all fairly reasonable choices for doing that. Might give you a better idea as to what sort of thing your army might look like at a given points level. You could try doing a bit of try before you buy by proxying models or using Tabletop Simulator to have a game or two if you're into that. And there's loads of stuff you'll be able to find on YouTube for the Adeptus Mechanicus. I made a few Admech videos including a codex review and an initial tier list for the units. I'll leave those links down in the video description. There's absolutely tons of stuff on other channels. Just search Admech and battle reports, painting guides and lore, and you'll get all sorts of other content there. Finally, it can be worth checking out social media. Admech Discords, Facebook or subreddits can just be nice places to go to get a bit of insight from other current collectors, see what people are thinking about making with their army at the moment or what questions they're asking, and can be a nice place to ask a few basics yourself from more experienced hobbyists. Perhaps somewhat early in the process, it might be an idea to plan out a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list, just to give you an idea as to what sort of way your force might be going. Battlescribe and New Recruit can be quite nice for that as easy list building tools, and you can decide whether you're going for a bit more of a general purpose all-encompassing Admech force or trying to take it down one specific theme. I'd say that compared with most armies in 40k, Mechanicus armies maybe don't generally tend to skew too heavily to one side of the codex or the other. I feel like quite a lot of people's collections wind up being at least somewhat balanced. They could potentially build into a full gunline army, or go surprisingly melee heavy and maybe play a riser themed force, picking up a lot of Sicarians or Fulgurite Electro Priests or punchy robots perhaps. You could build around either a specific detachment from the codex or a forge world from the lore, or go heavy on any one of the major Admech units that you can field, maybe going heavy on the Castellan robots or Cataphren servitors, or perhaps a lot of the skirmishing Skitarii type units. You can also create forces that are fairly heavily mechanised as well, say having loads of Dune Riders with elite infantry in them, and go for some sort of Admech Normandy landings type theme, or do at least relatively vehicle heavy forces as well, maybe a bunch of Onagers or Scorpius Disintegrators backed up by some Iron Striders. If you wanted to build the force around a forge world from the lore, there's really quite a lot of options. Most of them tend to sport the red robes, or at least some element of red, hailing from their spiritual homeworld of Mars. The classic Admech colour scheme that you can see in most of the cover art is from the actual forge world Mars itself, as you can see by this Skitarii Ranger here. There's plenty of others with their own cool backstories though, the Plasma Specialists and Hyper Aggression of Riser, the secretive and shadowy Styges 8, or the tortured metal hellscape that is Metallica, or harnessing the power of their solar world with Lucius. In the past, the detachments used to confer different rules on the army, but that's not so much the case anymore. Now basically any of these can field any of the Admech units, and do so in each one of the different detachments. Detachments in 10th edition tend to be the main way that armies get organised now. None of the Mechanicus ones lock out any models, so you could field any force in any one of these detachments, though the way that they sort of incentivise you to build around different things are that they have lots of their stratagems and benefits and abilities that only apply to one model class. Running through them briefly, we've got the Rad Zone Corps, which is generalist with a bombardment style rule. At least that got a bit more dangerous in the Codex now. Most of the other helpful bits can be used by a whole load of different elements of the army, so maybe doesn't encourage you to build too specialised. The Explorator Maniple has you nominating objectives to be secret architect markers that then your army can go after with a vengeance. They have some interesting enhancements that allow commanded squads to go after certain things very hard. The Scutari Hunter cohort mainly focuses on the Scutari and Elite Infantry specifically, with a bunch of stealth type tricks. The cohort Cybernetica goes for Castellan robots and vehicles, big chunky and tanky Mechanicus, and the stratagems get used in command phase programmed buffs for one unit or another. And the Data Storm Conclave focuses on the Cult Mechanicus type units, particularly the Cataphron Servitors and Electro Priests, giving them different canticles of the Omnissiah to incant. Definitely a lot of fun options out there, though it probably makes sense to start small, maybe just getting a few test models on the go to paint something up and get a colour scheme on the go. Maybe a Skitarii Ranger or Vanguard would be a good place to start there. Probably it makes sense to start with some more basic troopers until you've got a scheme that you've got at least somewhat confident with. Even the basic infantry are fairly detailed with these guys. I'd be most tempted to take a bit of inspiration from what other people have created online. There's plenty of great painting guides here on YouTube with people creating all sorts of fancy colour schemes and lots of ways to manifest that iconic Mars red. Games Workshop definitely have plenty of their own painting guides if you want to give them a search. There's loads from all sorts of independents too. As mentioned, Admech can take a bit longer to get paint on miniatures compared with some, just due to having really quite a lot of very detailed miniatures, and lots of elements like their flowing robes, metal, brass, and even some elements of wood and things on some of their models. With planning aside though, let's talk about some first purchases, things that you might first think about picking up for the army. I think I'd be most tempted currently to start out either with a box of just basic troops, probably the standard Skitarii box that you can see here, or maybe going for the Combat Patrol for Adeptus Mechanicus. Games Workshop's discount offerings, you might be able to find some older discount sets that are out of production now. That might be a little bit location or store dependent though. First up, this is the fairly recently redone Combat Patrol Adeptus Mechanicus. It does save a little bit of money compared with buying the miniatures separately, and in this one you get a Tech Priest Manipulus, 10 Skitarii that you can build as either Rangers or Vanguard, 3 Cerberus, the sort of dog horse cavalry that they've got, that you can build as either Raiders or Sulphur Hounds, and 5 Taraxi that you can build either as Skystalkers or Sterilizers, the guys with the flamethrower phosphor torches. This box set's £95, €125 or $160, meaning it's around about a 27% saving on buying these kits separately. So it does save you a fair bit of money if you wanted these specific kits, and I guess it's not the worst set of miniatures to start the faction with. Points in the box, it gets you around about 270 points, which is unfortunately the very lowest out of any of the Warhammer 40k Combat Patrol box sets. Kind of unfortunate for a kit that's usually pretty good for trying to get you started. This is kind of due to things like the Taraxi and the Cerberus just being enormously expensive in money costs for the amount of points that you get in game, despite in general the models being fairly popular looks-wise. It's maybe a bit of a shame that you don't get a few more of them in here. Overall, I'd say that all the miniatures are decently usable in game at least. The Manipulus might be a bit more at home buffing Cataphron servitors of one sort or another, giving them some lethal hits. Skitarii are pretty handy to have on the battle line, maybe the Vanguard more so than the Rangers, and the Taraxi and the Cerberus are nice for skirmish type units that you might want some of but not loads. Perhaps the biggest annoyance with this box set, aside from the low points cost in it, is that it doesn't really have any mainline damage dealers in my opinion. Everything here is sort of okay at skirmishing with enemy lighter to medium infantry, but won't really be doing too much damage to things like Terminators or vehicles. It means that you'll need some heavier guns to back this up to get a more well-rounded force. Overall though, in spite of that, I'd still probably pick at least one of these up if I was starting Adeptus Mechanicus. The discount is there at least. I feel like there's perhaps a bit more temptation to get 2 of these than some of the rest. Most of the units are ones that you could credibly double up on if you wanted to, and they've got the dual build options, so you can make, say, Sterilizers and Skystalkers. Just in general, when buying Warhammer 40k miniatures, I'd always bear in mind the different options than buying directly through Games Workshop. GW tend to be the most reliable, but then are also the most expensive, and for most people around the world I'd usually recommend buying through a local gaming store or an internet one, which usually has reasonable discounts above and beyond what Games Workshop prices are. For a few examples of those, there's Element Games giving around about a 15% discount on Warhammer in the UK, Fenris Workshop in Canada, and Gap Games in Australia. Particularly for expensive armies like Admech, I'd certainly recommend using. It will add up over the long term. There's links to those in the video description. There are affiliate links that help support the channel as well, if you did happen to use them. Otherwise though, plenty of other options. There's the second-hand market, with eBay often being worth a look. Quality will be a bit more variable on ready assembled and painted miniatures here, but it could be worth trying to save a bit of money if you can. Warhammer miniatures do generally tend to hold their price though. And particularly in this day and age, 3D printing and third-party manufacturers tend to be getting a bit more bold. And if you do a bit of Googling, you can find some alternative sculpts for quite a few Admech miniatures out there, which could be one way of getting into the army a little bit cheaper, at least for certain miniatures. Otherwise, for basic boxes of troops, if you started with the Skitarii Rangers or Vanguard, for getting those together, normally in 40k it makes sense to assemble all the special weapons on the squad. So that would be the Plasma Caliver, the Arc Rifle, and the Transuranic Arquebus. You're not paying any points to take them anymore, so you may as well have all three, and give the Alpha a fancy pistol and power weapon. I'd say that both flavours of the Skitarii troops do really look quite cool. At the moment in game, I'd be tempted to take more Vanguard than Rangers. They're a little bit cheaper and have some quite good rules for skirmishing for objectives, and seem to be quite nice jumping out of Dune Riders. Rangers still aren't the worst to have in a list though probably in smaller numbers, usually being there for the scout and the sticky objectives type rules they bring. In general, it's not the worst idea to have a solid core of the regular guys. The Vanguard at the moment are quite competitive. Otherwise, you might be able to get your hands on some older discount sets out there that might not have sold out various places. These were released by Games Workshop as single runs and are now gone from them. You might be able to find them at local stores in one place or another, and if you can find them at some sort of reasonable semblance of what they sold for initially, it could be a way to save some money. This one's the previous Combat Patrol that had some Cataphren Servitors and an Onager Dune Crawler. I feel like due to the inclusion of the tank, this one maybe had a bit more raw weight and mass to it. At least you get a relatively tough shooty walker there that can handle some enemy hard targets, and the Cataphrons are fairly dangerous as well. Otherwise, the Admech have had some other discount sets over the years. On the right you can see the Boarding Patrol that they had in early 2023. That had a Tech Priest Dominus and some Sicarians in there, alongside Cataphrons and the Skitarii Infantry. And on the bottom left here is the Elimination Maniple. This one has Belisarius Call, a unit of Skitarii, 2 units of Cataphrons, and 1 unit of Castellan robots. That one was a box set from last Christmas. Maybe not the worst pairing with the current Combat Patrol in the world for starting the faction, if you can find a copy of it somewhere. Otherwise, just for trying to get a bunch of points of Adeptus Mechanicus on the table earlier, there's some things that definitely cost you a lot more in terms of money for the amount of points that you put on the table, and some that might cost you a little bit less relatively speaking. Besides a few of the things that we've talked about, perhaps in particular Belisarius Core and the Castellan robots tend to get you a fair few more points than a bunch of other units that you can put on the table, at least for the amount of money invested. I would admit that Belisarius Core is fairly overcosted at the moment though, so that kind of feeds into that. On the other hand though, you might want to go kind of limited on the things that are perhaps notoriously expensive for Warhammer 40k value. These Cerberus Raiders and the Iron Strider Ballistarius / Dragoons tend to be some of the most expensive miniatures for the points on the table in 40k. Both of these can be less than 1 point per dollar, which is fairly easy maths for needing $2,000+ to make a 2,000 point Admech army if you're primarily built around these guys. It is a criticism of the army at the moment that they just don't really feel quite elite enough on the table. Otherwise though, for expanding a well-rounded force on the table, I'd probably just take it as a slow and measured effort rather than going out to buy too many things at once, collecting in small chunks or individual units, and gradually getting your way towards a larger force. As normal with Warhammer 40k, there's definitely a lot of scope for just collecting what you like the look of. The rules do generally tend to change over time with balance updates, though in general I'd say it's at least worth having a few units with big heavy guns that allow you to take down heavily armoured targets in the opponent's army, whether it's Cataphren Servitors or some of their heavier vehicles. For more powerful stuff in the book, these are some of the things that I'd rate as currently strongest, Certainly the Cataphren breaches don't look like they're going anywhere in terms of being a strong heart of the army. Track servitors with arc rifles and hydraulic claws, headed up by Tech Priest Manipuluses or Dominuses. Basically all of the Sidonian Dragoons and Iron Striders are good, I think almost problematically so given that Games Workshop charges so much for these fairly cheap walkers. Vanguard are looking great in Scorpius Dune Riders, the damage output isn't so bad now they can get reroll wound rolls quite easily, and Marshals can let them reroll hits if necessary. Then on top of that, there's lots of things that are fairly good for the skirmish style units, Taraxi, Cerberus and Infiltrators, all generally pretty handy to have a solid amount of, but not too much. Just feels like there's maybe some diminishing returns after having too many of them for things with a bit more raw durability or damage. Plenty of things do get a lot better in one detachment or another, of course. Fulgurite Electro Priests in the Datasarm Conclave hit really quite hard in melee on the charge, and the Onagers, Scorpiuses, and the Castellan robots all get a bit more support from the cohort Cybernetica if you were playing that detachment. Initially I'd probably plan out a rough 2000 point list going round one of the more generalist detachments and then work towards it, playing games and adapting your plans as you go. Finally, putting that all together in just one idea for an example army list for Admech, here's what a 2000 point army might look like when you've got it all together. This one isn't supposed to be anything too meta breaking or anything like that, it's just building out from one combat patrol, and then trying to include a fairly broad selection of units across the codex beyond that, and at least a nod towards being a bit more competitive with a bit of an emphasis on currently stronger stuff in game right now. Heading up this list, we've got a Tech Priest Manipulus with the Sustained Hits enhancement, who can go with the big chunky unit of the Cataphren Breachers with the arc rifles and hydraulic claws, and be a fairly murderous damage dealer centerpiece of the army. Then there's a Dominus with his 5+ Feel No Pain and the Autoclavic Denunciation, giving him some easy lethal hits against infantry. He'll be backing up a unit of Cataphren Destroyers with Grav Cannons and Cognis Flamers. Then there's a Cybernetica Datasmith with the Stealth Enhancement, all this from the Radzone core by the way, and he's leading a unit of 2 Castellan robots into battle, taking 1 Fist, 1 Phosphor Blaster and the Incendine Combustor, at least a fairly chunky threats to try and remove from objectives, and stealth should help with their survivability a bit. Then we've got a core of Skitarii Rangers and Vanguard, 3 units of Vanguard and 1 unit of Rangers, the Rangers handy for their sticky objectives and their scout move, and for the Vanguard 2 of them will be mounted in Scorpius Dune Riders, so some fast moving objective taking action there that can actually punch up a little bit with their special weapons, and 1 unit of them will hover around to babysit the Cataphren block as they need to have a Vanguard unit nearby to allow them to get full rerolls to hit. Then for some cheap skirmish infantry and secondary doers, there's some Taraxi Sterilizers, 5 of them with the Phosphor Torches. They can drop down to do secondaries or potentially barbecue foes on objectives. 1 squad of Scouting Cerberus Raiders to put some annoying cavalry in the midfield, and 1 unit of 5 Sicarian Infiltrators for some forward deploy and a bit of threat against lighter infantry. Then finally we've got 1 of each of the tanks and 4 Chicken Walkers. The Onager takes the Neutron Laser and the Scorpius Disintegrator the Ferromite Cannon, both of which just giving us a little bit more anti-tank punch. We've got 2 individual Iron Striders with las cannons and 2 individual Sidonian Dragoons, really quite cheap and tough walkers to march forward and be a nuisance, and also do threaten a bit of genuine damage as well. Overall, that's just a rough idea of what a 2000 point Admech army that's somewhat balanced could look like. I must admit though, getting here would take a bit of time and effort, quite a bit more so than some other factions. In any case, I think we'll leave that there for a few ideas of how to start Adeptus Mechanicus in 10th edition 40k. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. In particular, any insights as to how to start the army are particularly welcomed. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'll leave a link to the Admech tier list and codex review down in the video description. Finally, if you have been enjoying any videos on the channel, then I would just like to mention that the channel does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down below also, and that's the main way that I can keep on making videos like this pretty much every day. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.